Hello, Jessica Engel here from the Relationship Center. Today we are going to be creating a Triggers and Glimmers map. This is from Polyvagal Informed Psychotherapy. If you haven't watched the first two videos in this series, the overview video and the personal profile video, please go back and watch those. Those are really important for context. And as we learned in those first two videos, context or understanding why we're doing something is actually very important for feeling safe, being in that ventral state, which is key to learning. Okay. Today we're going to be creating a triggers and glimmers map. Triggers is probably a very familiar word to you. Triggers is what sends us to therapy. You are often aware on some level about the things that tend to dysregulate you. We're going to go a little more in depth on what those are today. We're also going to be looking at glimmers. Glimmers are, kind of the opposite of triggers in that they are things that soothe us. Okay. Now, both triggers and glimmers are things that are generally kind of happening without us necessarily wanting them to or asking them to. Certainly, glimmers are positive and pleasurable, but my point here is we don't necessarily control when they happen. Okay. We can leverage glimmers to become regulating resources, which are tools that we use to regulate ourselves. But for now, we're really going to be looking at glimmers that are unexpected. They are maybe transient. They're sort of gifts from life itself. Okay. So you can think of a glimmer as like a smile from a stranger, or the sound of a bird, or a memory of a good friend. Okay. These are often fleeting, they can be very sensory, and they're generally cues of safety that are in our environment, in a relationship, or internal. The reason we really want to understand our triggers and glimmers is that we have a greater capacity to regulate ourselves, to take a regulating action when we are fully aware of what puts us into a dysregulated state and what helps us get out of it. Okay, so it gives us a lot more choice in our day-to-day life. I think part of the quality of a trigger is that we all of a sudden are flooded with some very difficult emotion or dysregulation, right? A sympathetic state or a dorsal state. And it's automatic. We weren't looking for it, and all of a sudden it's here. Okay. Having some awareness of what kicks us into that stress response, A, can attenuate the stress response, and B, can really give us enough space from the trigger to make a choice to regulate ourselves. Okay. With glimmers, really understanding them, we can really leverage that to move back up into ventral more and more often. And some glimmers can be made into regulating resources. This is something we're going to go over in our next video. Okay, it can really leverage glimmers to create new tools that help us feel safe. Okay, so that's all the background. Let's dive into creating our map. You're going to get a piece of paper. Some people like to do this on their computer. You are hopefully going to have some colored implements. You can see the map on here does have different colors. This is like in the personal profile map as well. And what I'd like you to do is that you're going to choose either sympathetic or dorsal to start. Okay. I want you to choose whichever state you tend to spend more time in. Some people say, it's half and half. So if it's half and half, just choose one. And you're going to choose a color that represents that state. And in that section, you've split your paper into three. In the section that represents whichever state, dysregulated state you tend to be in more, you are going to write down triggers. Okay. So go ahead and I want you to start with any triggers that bring you into this particular state. And let's start with triggers that are in the environment. So let me give you some more examples of environmental triggers. An environmental trigger might be someone cutting you off on the road as you're driving. It could be stormy clouds. It could be an empty bench, right? It can be any sort of thing. So anything in the environment around you. Go ahead and write down those triggers. And as you are going through this practice, you may notice that whatever state you're working on gets stimulated in you. So taking nice deep breaths as you're doing this. If at any point you become overwhelmed by this state, I want you to stop and take good care of yourself. Um, and hopefully you are doing this practice before a therapy session. Some people even like to do it within a therapy session, just like we did with the personal profile map. Okay, so hopefully by now you've written down any environmental triggers for the state that you are currently working on, either sympathetic or dorsal. Next, I want you to write down any relational triggers that bring you into this particular state. A relational trigger would be something like um, that kind of stern look my mom gives me, or that tone of voice that my partner uses when they're upset, or not hearing from my friend for several days after I reached out. Go ahead and write those down. Great. We're going to move on to the third type of trigger. If at any point in this video I'm going too quickly or too slowly, feel free to pause me or speed me up. Um, let's go ahead and move on to internal triggers. So, an internal trigger is anything that happens in your inner landscape that tends to dysregulate you. So, an example of this might be when I think to myself, oh, I did it again, or when I um, have that feeling in my chest where there's a lot of tightness. Or when I think about that time when that really scary thing happened. Okay, go ahead and write down your internal triggers for this particular state. Okay, and we are going to move on to the next section. And of course, if you need more time, go ahead and pause me. But if not, if you're finished, you're going to go ahead and move on to the next section. You're going to choose a color that represents this section. And let's go ahead and start with the external triggers that tend to bring you into that state. So again, external triggers are things like um, being um, a scared dog, or it could be um, seeing a car crash, for example. And again, the state might get mobilized as you work on this section. Nice deep breaths can be helpful to move a little bit. Let's go ahead and move on to relational triggers for this particular state. So again, that can be something like when my um, partner doesn't look at me when I come in the room, or when my teacher um, calls on me multiple times in class. Go ahead and write down any relational triggers for this state. And we're going to go ahead and move on to any internal triggers. Okay. So, as a reminder, an internal trigger might be something like when my inner critic is blasting me about how I did in that work presentation, or um, the pit of my stomach feeling when I'm um, meeting up with somebody that makes me a little bit anxious. Okay. And you may need more time. If so, go ahead and pause me. But if not, you can put down the pen that you chose for this section. You're going to choose a color that represents ventral. This is the fun part. We're going to move on to glimmers. And I want you to write down, first and foremost, any environmental glimmers. So these might be things like sunflowers or um, a lake or a beautiful sunset. Anything that really soothes your nervous system that's in the external world. Next, you're going to go ahead and write down relational glimmers. So these are cues of safety within relationships. These might be things like warm smile from a stranger, uh, snuggles from my puppy. It could be being told I've done a great job by my manager at work, anything along those lines. And we're going to move on to the last section. Pause me if I'm going too quickly, but the last section in the glimmers, this is internal glimmers. So these can be things like a nice, spontaneous deep breath. It can be that memory of summer camp when I was in seventh grade. And it can be self-compassionate statements. Go ahead and write those down. Okay, good work. I encourage you to share what you learned here with somebody in your life who is following along on your self-regulation journey, your relational healing journey, whether that's your therapist or a friend. And I will be back for a fourth video in this series on creating a regulating resources map so that you really know what tools to use when you're in various dysregulated states. Okay.